those officers, they get to live.
Mr. Floyd, we grieve with you, and we appreciate very much your courage to be here with us today. My time has expired, but may Mrs. Underwood-Jacobs address the committee as well?
By all means.
Thank you, Mr. Floyd.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Congresswoman Roby. I have to say that I'm heartbroken. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to my brother either before he was killed. I am also heartbroken for all of the other people that are in this country living every single day and feel unsafe just to drive to the store. I also have had the talk with my son. We sit here today at somewhat opposite ends of the spectrum to a certain degree, but yet there is so much commonality amongst both of us. And the heartbreak and the grief is inexplainable because it's very, very hard to articulate when your entire world has been turned upside down. I do want to know, though, when I think about all of this, is that my brother wore a uniform, and he wore that uniform proudly. I'm wondering, where is the outrage for a fallen officer that also happens to be African American? So as I'm sitting here and I'm listening to all of you and us, I truly hope that you take your positions, your offices so seriously that you want to go back and really work together and collaborate. Because if you can't get it right, there's no hope for the rest of us. So when you go back and you convene and you talk through everything that's going on, I hope that we're just not people on paper, but the fact that you could be able to see our faces and feel our pain and feel it enough that you want to make change for all the citizens of the United States of America.
Again, we grieve with you both, and we thank you very much for your courage to be with us here today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very rarely I'm at a loss of words or know where to start. And I want to start with you, Miss Angela Underwood-Jacobs, and just say that you have my condolences, my sympathy, and my prayers. And unfortunately, this was the hearing you were invited to. You were not invited to the hearings where in Homeland Security we talk about the threat to our law enforcement officers that put on blue and black every day. The fact that we tried to get more vests for police officers and the other side fought it. The fact that we wanted to fight sovereign citizens that's killed more police officers in this country than anybody else and the other side fought it. But they invited you to this hearing, and I just want you to know that we have fought for increased survivor benefits for the families of officers, and we respect those who serve our communities. And then, Mr. Floyd, Falonis, let me just tell you that when I met with you in Houston and your family, the remarkable thing is you all asked for two things, neither of which was for you. Justice for George and a just society. And that's why we're here today. And the unfortunate part is, in this process, we speak and we leave. But there's one thing that I want to address. Mr. Buck came and said that it was politicians that has messed up the family unit in America. That could somewhat be true. But for him, how do you ignore the white man's knee on the neck of black people for 401 years and act like that has nothing to do with where we are? But part of the reason why I am so encouraged today is more people are recognizing that now. And the systematic racism and oppression that has existed, that we're now coming together to fight and establish a solution. It was Dr. King in his letter from a Birmingham jail that he actually responded to his critics for the first time, because he said that he would assume they were people of goodwill with sincere concerns. Over my better judgment, I will assume the other side is people of goodwill and sincere concern in some of these arguments why we can't or shouldn't pass this bill. But the other part I want you all to understand is the outrage that I have. Because it was 1988 91 when the movie Boys in the Hood came out. And the last line in the movie said either they don't know, they don't show, or they don't care what happens in the hood. Well, if you didn't know, now you know. Because the protesters, the peaceful protesters out there are showing you what's happening. Video footage is showing us what's happening. So then you go to the last line, and the real question is, do we care? And I believe that this piece of legislation is a good piece of legislation that moves the ball forward. It is very easy to sit on the other side and let perfection be the enemy of the good, or just sit back with inertia and we never move the ball forward. We have an obligation to the next generation of kids, to men and women walking the streets now, to make sure we move the ball forward. You know, every once in a while, we've tried it the other way all this time. We're just asking you to try it our way this time. Let's pass some legislation. Let's hold the bad police officers accountable. And we always say bad apples. Well, the saying is enough bad apples to fall a bunch. So let's make sure that we're talking about it. Mr. Mayor, 30 seconds. I was the beneficiary of your reforms. And what you did was you moved some resources from a constitutional police department that created to after school funding and things that the community can do better than police. 20 seconds. Can you explain that? And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The disinvestment in those types of programs over the last 20 years, some of it's happened in this Congress. The elimination of a summer youth employment program, the elimination of supports for children. Baltimore City, no extracurricular activities in their schools. So we can fix police this, and we need to do some other things to address those other systemic issues. And you're right. I moved $1 million the first 30 days I was in office from police overtime to create a summer job program, because there was no money. And the summer job program and the camps for kids and the outdoor camps for inner city kids, that didn't cost a dime. It gave kids, a person like you, a chance to enroll at LSU Dental School. Those made great differences. And part of this conversation about, quote unquote, don't want to open a Pandora's box, defunding police is really not about defunding police. It's about funding other things that have been ignored and forgotten, investing in young people and youth. You're a middle-class parent in America today. Your kids go to dance class, you pay. Karate, pay. Little League Baseball, pay. Inner city kid, no opportunity if it's not provided by the public dollars. You go back to 1950s in America, when immigrants made up the vast majority, European immigrants made up the vast majority of major American cities, and you had free recreation programs and free summer camps. And on our watch, these cities change. Somehow, some way, a lot of that has gone away. So we're there trying to patch together dollars and patch together work. So it's important to understand this bill is about reforming policing, which is a pillar. There's a separate discussion and an additional discussion that needs to be had about how we do all the other things. And I want to work with you all on that, but don't confuse the two. I mean, that's the thing. People want to confuse the two. And just, I'll say respectfully, bad family situation didn't kill George Floyd. Sir, that's an outrage. It's an absolute outrage to think that bad family, I am tired trying to change the issue when we have police brutality and police misconduct to this rhetoric about bad family situations. It's an insult, and it needs to stop. It needs to stop. I sit, I take it, I listen, but not at this moment. Not at this time. Let's fix policing in America. Let's focus on that. There's ample time to do other things. As I said earlier, it's a moral moment. It's time for that. We're called to act. Yes, figure out a way to do it in a bipartisan way. But go back and look. On the other side of this Capitol, there are 2 office buildings named for United States senators, both of whom have a legacy of what we're talking about today. One is Richard P. Russell, a man who led the filibuster against the anti-lynching law for decades. The other, Everett McKinley Dirksen, a Republican from Illinois, who provided the courage to help President Johnson pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's the moment we're in.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm struck today by a lot of testimony and that we're hearing some of the same recurring themes. And it is a moral moment, Mr. Morial, my friend from Louisiana, as you said. One of the recurring themes that we've heard many times this morning, members is about the need to rebuild relationships. You know, one of the founders, I think, I can't remember who it was, said there are thousands hacking at the branches of evil to one who's striking at the root. And one of those root problems in this moral moment is that we don't know each other anymore. You know, that's kind of how society and culture have evolved. And we all agree on the objective, I think, obviously, by the comments this morning, of rebuilding relationships. But I think we need to drill down a little bit. Public policy is one thing, but this is a hard issue, as we all agree. And to determine what the best, most effective methods are to achieve that objective that we all agree on. So I just wanted to ask a couple of our witnesses, beginning with Mr. Crump. I appreciate what you said this morning. We had a little sidebar over here, and I like the heart that you bring to this issue. And I wanted to ask your opinion on that, because you mentioned that in your remarks about the need to build relationships. And so from your experiences and everything you've been doing, what do you think are some ways we can do that between members of our communities and law enforcement officials?
Certainly. Thank you, Representative Johnson. I do think we have to work together. At the crux of the matter, it's a lack of trust, I believe, between communities of color and law enforcement, because we have to have transparency, which we haven't had in the police killings of black people. As one of the witnesses said, you go to a secret grand jury proceeding like Eric Gardner or any 100 other cases, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and they come back after the secret grand jury and say, no indictment, we didn't find evidence, even though we all saw it with our eyes. And so you have to have transparency, and then you have to have accountability, and that's how you get to trust. I think you said something that I agree with. It's about transparency, it's about training, and then termination. And we got to terminate police. We don't do it. I mean, we just don't do it. We don't send them to jail. We don't even fire them when they kill black people. And so, as Palona said, we got to care. As Representative Richmond said, do we care? Because our actions don't construe that. And so, first, we got to just get to the core. It's transparency, accountability, and then maybe we can get the trust, because we do see it from the other side that black people, the prison industrial complex, school to prison pipeline, you see it all the time. You go into jail, but then when we're the victim, you don't see convictions like Eric Gardner or any of these other cases.
I appreciate those comments, and I think that it goes even more fundamental than that, in that it's the relationships even in the communities. Before you can get to building trust, with law enforcement, it's with our neighbors too, right? I was on the phone last night with the local director of YMCA, and he had this idea to use the YMCA facilities in my community as a neutral forum where he would have these events, an activities night, Saturday night, or maybe Sunday nights, and he'd invite one black church and one white church, right? Just put everybody together in the same facility and let them get to know each other and have fun together, and just simple things like that I think we ought to foster and try to encourage. And it doesn't have anything to do with the law, really, or public policy. It's about being good Americans and good neighbors, and I hope we can get back to that. Maybe this is a flashpoint to do it. If Mr. Davis is still with us, I know he was with us remotely. I'm really interested in his experience at DOJ and the community-oriented policing services, and I know that's a big function of this as well. I wonder if he could speak to that issue, if he's still with us on the idea of building those relationships and community policing as an important function of that.
Yes, Congressman, I am still here, and thank you very much for the question. And I would say with the COPS office, it has a great opportunity to actually do that, to facilitate community policing. That's really its charge. It's its charge to be able to identify the best practices of community policing, how to engage through our grant program, to incentivize best practices through our grant programs, our hiring process. We are hiring in the spirit of service. And so I think it does help out a lot. If I could say one thing, Congressman, the key to that is there are over 16,000 individual police agencies in the country. Most of them are 25 officers or fewer. So without the help of the COPS office or the federal government, it is hard to infuse those types of training and information and best practices. And so the COPS office is a key as a linchpin to make sure that whether it's 2 officers or 4,000, they have opportunity for best practices. But that was our goal, was to advance community policing. This still probably should be the goal today. I do say we have stepped away from that from a lot of the programs that we were offering at one time.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The chokehold and other police tactics, such as a knee to the neck, are inherently dangerous and present an unreasonable risk of serious bodily injury or death. That is why the Justice in Policing Act will make such strangulation tactics unlawful pursuant to our nation's civil rights laws. President Davis, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, supports criminalizing chokeholds and other strangulation tactics as a matter of law. Is that correct?
So this is for Ron Davis. Yes, sir, it is.
Ms. Gupta, does the civil rights community support criminalizing chokeholds and other strangulation tactics as a matter of federal law?
We do, and in fact, there are departments around the country that have already banned them, and so this is about making that the national standard.
Professor Butler, is it fair to say that the neck should be off limits during police encounters?
Use your mic, Mr. Butler, please.
Thank you, sir. When the police use pain compliance techniques like neck restraints, it prevents blood and oxygen from going to the lungs and brain. There's a great risk of death.
Black Lives Matter, yet month after month, year after year, decade after decade, the list of tragedy continues to grow. Amadou Diallo, dead. Sean Bell, dead. Eric Garner, dead. Tamir Rice, dead. Walter Scott, dead. Oscar Grant, dead. Yvette Smith, dead. Stephon Clark, dead. Breonna Taylor, dead. George Floyd, dead. But Mr. Bongino, the police are at times able to show restraint under very difficult circumstances. Is that correct?
Of course.
Let's review a few examples. In 2012, James Holmes entered a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and opened fire on an audience, killing 12 people and injuring 70. Mr. Holmes was heavily armed with an AR-15, 12-gauge shotgun, and 40 caliber handgun. Yet he was taken into police custody outside of that very same movie theater without incident. Mr. Bongino, James Holmes is white. Is that correct?
I'm not sure of his background. I don't know James Holmes personally.
He's white. 2014, Dylan Roof massacred 9 black parishioners at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston. Mr. Roof was heavily armed with a high-powered Glock, 45 caliber pistol, and 88 rounds. The police somehow arrested Dylan Roof without incident and even treated him to Burger King. Mr. Bongino, Dylan Roof is white. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know where you're going with this. So if he's white, that doesn't make him any better, or it was an awful thing he did, whether he was white or black. I'm not sure where you were going with this.
Dylan Roof was white. And last year,
he's awful.
In El Paso, Texas, Patrick Crucius killed 23 people and injured dozens during a shooting rampage. He used an AK-47 and was heavily armed. Yet somehow he was arrested without incident. Mr. Bongino, Patrick Crucius was white, is that correct?
Sir, I have no idea of I don't know his parentage.
He was white.
Again, I don't know why you're making a racial thing.
Reclaiming my time. Yeah. Because black lives matter, sir.
Yeah, all lives matter, sir. Every single life matters. White, black, Asian,
Professor Butler,
else.
You have heavily armed mass murderers in places like Aurora, Charleston, and El Paso, somehow apprehended by police without incident. That's the point, sir.
I arrested those people, sir.
Innocent,
you didn't.
Innocent, unarmed African Americans are repeatedly killed in police encounter after police encounter. Is it fair to say that the difference, which seems explicable in police behavior, somehow relates, at least in part, to race?
In law and in police practices, black lives do not have the same value that white lives have.
All we simply want is for every single community, regardless of race, to be able to breathe the free air of liberty and justice for all. That's what the Justice in Policing Act is all about. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here because we've recently suffered multiple failures of law enforcement, beginning with the killing of George Floyd. He died because a rogue cop with multiple complaints for misconduct was allowed to remain on a police force, as did one of his accomplices. This has become an intolerable pattern in big city police forces, and we need to ask how politically powerful police unions and the politicians they maintain in office protect the bullies in the system that inevitably lead to atrocities like this. The other failure was the decision to withhold police protection from their citizens by mayors and their appointed police chiefs. That failure killed Pat Underwood, killed David Dorn, and so many other innocent victims in the ensuing riots. Withdrawing police protection from our streets, abandoning police stations to rioters, turning a blind eye to looting, arson, and mayhem, all have an incendiary effect on insurrections. Without law enforcement, there is no law. And without law, there is no civilization. An accounting of the deaths and destruction caused by these acts of dereliction have yet to be tallied, but it's going to be staggering. Now, we meet today to chart a course forward, and I think we can look to no better guide than Sir Robert Peel, the father of modern policing, who set forth principles of law enforcement for a free society nearly 2 centuries ago. And when you read them, you realize how far we have drifted from these moorings. Central to our discussion is his 7th principle, quote, to maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public, and that the public are the police. The police being only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence, end of quote. So how do we get back to these principles? I think there are many proposals that have been raised in the House that merit support. And first is the doctrine of qualified immunity. As it's currently applied, it has no place in a nation ruled by laws. For every right, there must be a remedy. And qualified immunity prevents a remedy for those whose rights have been violated by officials holding a public trust. And this reform should apply as much to a rogue cop who targets people because of their race as it does to IRS or Justice Department officials who target people on the basis of their politics. Reforming qualified immunity simply holds public officials to the same standards as any other citizen exercising the same powers. Second, police records must be open to the public. It is a well-established principle that public servants work for the public, and the public has a right to know what they're doing with the authority the public has loaned them. And police departments should be able to dismiss bad officers without interference from the unions. By preventing the public from access to these records and preventing departments from acting on them, we destroy the very foundation of successful policing in a free society: public trust and accountability. Third, turning police departments into paramilitary organizations is antithetical to the sixth principle laid down by Peel, quote, to use only the minimum degree of physical force which is necessary on any particular occasion for achieving a police objective. Weapons that are unique to a battlefield need to be limited to a battlefield. Fourth, no-knock warrants have been proven to be lethal to citizens and to police officials for obvious reasons. The invasion of a person's home is one of the most terrifying powers the government possesses. Every person in a free society has the right to take arms against an intruder in their homes. And that means that the authority of the police must be announced before that intrusion takes place. To do otherwise places every one of us in mortal peril. So I think these four reforms are legitimate powers for the federal government to uphold the constitutional rights of its citizens. But it's not within our legitimate power to dictate training and procedures for every community in the country. As Peel counsels us, effective law enforcement is a community endeavor, and every community has different needs and different circumstances which require different standards. One-size-fits-all bromides are at best ineffective and at worst dangerous. And then finally, lest we forget, when faithful, dedicated, honest police officers, and that is the vast, vast majority of those who serve us, when they are attacked and degraded and disrespected and demoralized and hamstrung and withdrawn, those most at risk are the poor and the defenseless who live and work in our inner cities. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Chairwoman Bass. I'm so grateful for this piece of legislation and for your leadership. I want to thank all the panelists who are here with us today. Mrs. Underwood Jacobs, I want you to know that we hear and we feel and we see your pain. And we are praying for justice for you and your entire family as well. Our sincerest condolences. Thank you for being here. Mr. Floyd, thank you for your incredible courage. I cannot imagine the strength that it took to be here with us today, but you did it. I want you to know that for those of us who are mothers, it tore us up to hear your brother call out for your mother. We heard him and we hear you, and we are going to continue to fight for justice for as long as we can. You know, people are marching in the streets all over this country and all over the world, marching for justice, marching to force us to rise to this moment. And it is our obligation and our duty to rise to this moment. I have heard from many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle their desire to work in a bipartisan nature on this bill and to achieve an outcome worthy of the American people who have entrusted us in this moment. And so my request today of my colleagues for the remainder of this hearing, for our markup next week, and for the day that it comes to the floor, let us focus on what is in the bill, not what is not in the bill. I've heard a lot of conversations from this dais about issues that are being debated outside of this room. Those debates are important, those debates are healthy, those debates are part of American democracy, but they're not in the bill. If we truly are going to come to a bipartisan agreement and provide for this country the justice that it is seeking, let's focus on what is in the bill. Mr. Butler, Professor Butler, we have heard much about the disproportionate impact that police brutality has had on the African American community. And we have also heard much about the fact that, well, let's focus on family. Well, let's focus on God. And no one disputes that as a country and as a government, we should be making investments in education, investments in healthcare, investments in community. But in terms of really fully coming to grips with what is happening in terms of race and law enforcement in this country, we know that unarmed Black Americans were 5 times as likely as unarmed white Americans to be shot and killed by a police officer. To what do you attribute that fact? And your microphone, please, sir.
A legacy, Congresswoman, of white supremacy, a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, and then an evolution from the old Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow, where the stereotypes and the biases against people of color don't go away, but they just take different forms.
That's absolutely correct. Mr. Floyd, I want to ask you, as a Black man in America, do you live in fear that you will one day be a target as well?
Yes, ma'am. Every day I walk around, I ask myself, am I next? Am I next all the time? Because I don't want to do anything wrong to make anybody think that I'm doing wrong. So just try to live life and just have faith and hope everything comes out the right way. But basically, that's it. Just a Black man just trying to go to work every day and go back home safely. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Floyd. If we are truly to come to an agreement on this legislation, if we are truly to rise to this moment, we have to acknowledge the truth that is looking at us in the face every single day in America. We have to rise to this occasion. We have to do justice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, I'd like to just point out something. When we started, Mr. Floyd spoke first, and it was very passionate. I was very moved. But then, for some reason, you didn't have Mrs. Underwood Jacobs speak about the loss of her brother, and it really surprised me, quite frankly. And I thought it was very disrespectful. I don't know if that's what you meant, but I wanted to say that. I want to thank all of you for coming here, and I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Floyd, and for your loss, Ms. Underwood Jacobs. You know, I have 2 Black grandsons, and so, you know, I haven't experienced the discrimination that some of you have experienced, that you have told us about, but I sure don't want them to be discriminated against. So this is very important to me. But there's another thing going on here that I just want to read some tweets. This is very disturbing to me. First of all, in early June, Brian Fallon, the executive director of Demand Justice and the former press secretary to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign and spokesman for Attorney General Eric Holder, tweeted, "Defund the police." On June 5th, Representative Ilhan Omar, who represents Minneapolis in Congress, tweeted, "The Minneapolis Police Department has proven themselves beyond reform. It's time to disband them and reimagine public safety in Minneapolis." Minneapolis City Council member Jeremiah Ellison, son of Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, tweeted, "We are going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department." Lisa Bender, the president of the Minneapolis City Council, tweeted, "We are going to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department." I read that Patrice Cullors, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, wants to see police forces abolished entirely, eventually. And Steve Fletcher, Minnesota City Council member, also stated that he and City Council President and the chair of the Public Safety are calling to disband our police department. Mr. Borgino, I am a survivor of domestic violence from a previous marriage. And I remember when my neighbors called the police. And I don't know why, but I disputed. When the police came to the door, I said, "Oh, I'm fine. Nothing happened. Everything's good here." If we disband, dismantle, defund, reduce funding in the police, what's going to happen to the woman that calls out who's a victim of domestic violence? What's going to happen to response time? What's going to happen in that situation, do you think?
Well, I became a police officer. I wanted to be a doctor precisely because in a situation, without rendering any further embarrassment to people in my family, the police officer showed up and dissuaded a member of my family from doing something he shouldn't have been doing. And this person wasn't scared of anything. He was only scared of the police. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean he didn't want to go to jail. It's the only thing, I was about 9 or 10, it's the only thing that brought peace to me that night. I knew I wanted to be a cop the moment after that. You know, this defund the police abomination will lead to a catastrophe like you've never seen. I can't emphasize that in strong enough terms. I worked in a largely minority precinct, East New York, Brooklyn, the 7-5 precinct. It's a tough place to work. I was young. I was in my 20s. The only time I was ever physically attacked by someone was in a domestic violence situation. I have nothing but the utmost respect for social workers, medics, EMTs, and firemen. I mean that. Running into a burning building is tough. Saving someone's life and catching a pulse in the last minutes, that's tough. But when I walked into that house, make no mistake, that man, and forgive me for not saying my sincere, my heartfelt empathy with you for having gone through that, having lived through it myself. I should have opened with that. I mean that. But that man in that house, I'll never forget it. He wasn't going to be stopped. There was no negotiating. This isn't a movie, folks. This is real. He wasn't going to be stopped from attacking his wife. There was a 5 or 6-year-old, I don't know the age, cowering in the corner. I told this story recently because it's so tattooed on my brain, I'll never forget it. You know what that's like? Cowering in the corner. You know, the daddy stop. The guy wasn't going to be stopped. He didn't care that we had guns. You think he's going to care if it's a social worker? Again, I'm not sure where this ridiculous absurdity of defunding the police came from, but I didn't come here with some partisan agenda, and frankly, I'm deeply offended at some who've made it so, including mischaracterizing my comments by Mr. Muriel, which was offensive to me, too. You can pound a table all you want, but that's not what I said. Black families matter to me, too. That was my point. Not that the tragic death of Mr. Floyd had anything to do with that. But what about black families that are the subject of domestic violence? The guy I stopped hit me with an ironing board. You know that? And luckily my partner was there to save me, and that woman, and that crying 5-year-old child.
Lady's time has expired.
Thank you.
Jayapal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Floyd, please accept my deepest condolences for your brother's death. It is one too many deaths that result from centuries-old pervasive violence and anti-blackness at the hands of the police. I promise you that we intend to honor George Floyd with the most sweeping changes to policing that this House has seen in recent memory. Banning chokeholds, no-knock warrants, making lynching a federal crime, and investing in community-based models that provide community safety for all. That is all we can do. We cannot bring him back, but we can honor him with real change. I want to bring into this room the name of Charlena Lyles, a pregnant Black woman and mother of 5 in Seattle, and with her, the many Black women across the country who have lost their lives or their children. 3 years ago, the Seattle Police Department responded to a call from Ms. Lyles, who had been flagged, and it's why we must pass as a critical first step the Justice in Policing Act. Professor Butler, I want to start with you. Is any amount of crisis training to teach officers how to interact with individuals with mental health issues sufficient in and of itself to overcome what we're calling the warrior mentality that exists within law enforcement?
Congresswoman, if the culture of police departments isn't shifted away from that warrior mentality, then no other reform would matter. Guardianship is the model that President Obama's commission recommended. If you think about it, if you're applying for a job as a warrior, you're going to have one resume and one group of skill sets. If you're applying for a job to be a guardian, to be a caretaker for your community, you have a different resume and a different set of skills. Congresswoman Lesko, thank you so much for sharing your story. I heard that story as a failure of policing. What I imagined what if responders had shown up who understand what your experience is like as a survivor. It's too often the case that survivors don't go to the police or shun the police because the police aren't going to give them the service that they need. Imagine if a guardian had shown up instead. What a difference that might have made.
Thank you, Professor Butler. Ms. Gupta, as you know, the Seattle Police Department is in its 8th year under a federal consent decree that was based upon DOJ's finding that excessive force was most often used against people of color and those who were either mentally or chemically impaired. And as you know, initially there were some wonderful positive changes that occurred. However, 8 years later, we have run into some roadblocks where reforms recommended by the Community Police Commission that were set up were ignored by city leaders and not incorporated into police union contracts. And the recent protests on the streets here in Seattle have been met by a police force that uses use of force against peaceful protesters. You have talked about a phrase, culture eats policy for lunch. Can you explain what that phrase means to you and what tools within this bill are most important and what else is needed to truly bring about justice in policing that meets the cries of the protesters on the streets?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the success of any kind of long-term reform effort or a consent decree, Congresswoman, is where there's leadership and there's an effort that is sustained over time to change the culture of policing. It is what Professor Butler was alluding to just now. And it doesn't happen overnight, but it requires sustained commitment. And I look at Justice in Policing Act and I look at the provisions in there that are seeking to ensure accountability, because when people feel like their police department can act with impunity and no accountability, when police officers feel like there is no accountability or consequences on the other side, the culture of a police department becomes very hard to change. And no matter how many policies you change, how much you overhaul in terms of the policing manual and the like, the culture piece is actually the thing that takes the longest amount of time to shift. It requires constant and persistent leadership at the top, and it requires a commitment to changing and reflecting a system of policing that is much more guardian-oriented than warrior. I will also say that I think right now there is a hunger in the streets and in communities around the country to recognize that people want other options in their communities other than to call 911 and have a police officer come at the door when people are in mental health crisis, for homelessness issues and school discipline issues. And they want to, and I've heard this from police chiefs. The International Association of Chiefs of Police issued a very powerful statement 2 days ago recognizing the systematic decades of underinvestment in the kinds of social systems in housing, in homelessness, and education, and how that's all been placed at the feet of police officers. And so there is this needs to be a holistic evaluation of what spending priorities have been in communities that have been saturated with a criminal justice response, but underinvested with resources for education and jobs and the like.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta. Mr. Morial, let me end with you. We recognize, as Ms. Gupta was saying, that too often. Has my time expired, Mr. Chairman? I can't see the timer.
The time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of important things have been said here today, but maybe the most important and frankly the most succinct was a statement that Mr. Floyd made earlier at the prompting of very first round of questioning from Mr. Gates when he asked Mr. Floyd to respond to something Ms. Underwood Jacobs had said during her testimony. And he said, life is precious. Life is precious. George Floyd's life was precious. Pat Underwood's life is precious. Life is precious. Our country, the greatest country ever, started on that premise. The document that launched this experiment in liberty we call America says this: we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think it's interesting to think of the order the founders placed the rights they chose to mention. Can you pursue your goals and dreams and happiness if you first don't have liberty, if you first don't have freedom? And do you ever have liberty and freedom if government won't protect your most basic right, your right to life? Because Mr. Floyd is right. Life is precious. Mr. Bongino, you agree with that statement? Life is precious?
Absolutely.
And you protect it every day in your job, your previous job. Is that right?
The best of my ability.
You were a New York City police officer. You protected life every time you put on that uniform and did your shift, did your service. Is that right?
Proudly so.
And when you were in the Secret Service, you protected life. You protected some pretty important life.
Barack Obama, President Bush.
Two presidents of our great country.
That's correct.
And when you protected that life, you actually risked another precious life. You risked your life. Is that accurate?
It's accurate.
And officers do that every single day, don't they?
8 hours a day, 5 days a week.
Every day. And that is why you have been so strong in your language about this concept of defunding the police, abolishing the police, a policy proposal that is not consistent with the statement made, the best statement made here today by George Floyd's brother, which says life is precious. I think in your testimony earlier you said if police forces are abolished, if police forces are defunded, it's not some, I think you used the word amorphous mass. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about officers who put on the uniform and go protect our communities. It will put their lives at risk, won't it?
There's absolutely no question.
And just as importantly, because life is precious, it will put people's life at risk in the communities those law enforcement officers serve. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, and anyone supporting this should take an oath today to go to the many funerals of the thousands of black lives, Hispanic lives, and white lives that will unquestionably be lost in the chaos that ensues in depoliced streets. You should commit today and raise your right hand to go to those funerals and listen to those crying parents watching their sons and daughters in those caskets. You want to vote for it? Then you go see the consequences of it, because the streets will be chaos. And you can't run away after that. Everyone will know what you did if you choose to go down this road.
Let's protect life. Let's recognize exactly what Mr. Floyd said. Life is precious, and let's do that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you. And first, to Ms. Underwood Jacobs and Mr. Floyd, my condolences to you. Ms. Underwood Jacobs, the Bay Area law enforcement community grieves with you. My younger brother was working just 2 blocks around the corner from where your brother was that night when he passed, and we grieve with you, and we'll work to try and find his killers. Mr. Floyd, we know a lot about what happened to your brother because of a citizen's video. But let's say we didn't have the video, just the report. And too often that's what we're left with. And in that report, a statement issued by the Minneapolis Police Department, they said that after Mr. Floyd got out, he physically resisted officers. You've watched that painful video. Did you ever see your brother resist officers?
David, you take the chair for a couple of minutes. Yeah,
Like, too emotional right now to just talk about a lot. I'd rather just have my attorney.
The officers, it also said the officers were able to get the suspect into handcuffs and noted he was suffering medical distress. Mr. Crump, did you ever see that? Other than the distress of an officer's knee on his neck, did you see what was described in the statement released by the Minneapolis Police Department?
No, sir, we did not. The video, we saw him face down in handcuffs.
It also said, at no time were weapons of any type used by anyone involved in this incident. Well, you had a highly trained and experienced police officer using his knee. You would agree that that knee, in that case, was a weapon. Is that right?
Absolutely. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
A weapon used for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And too often in our criminal justice system, the deck is stacked against persons of color because of statements that are falsely made in police statements and then put out to the public when there were no cameras, no public footage. And Ms. Gupta, do you believe that the Justice and Policing Act, by having a body camera requirement, an independent investigation into misconduct, and a national police misconduct registry could go a long way to make sure that we don't have more false statements?
I think the Justice and Policing Act contains several provisions that are really, really important to transforming the culture of policing in America, yes.
And I was consulting with an African-American member of my community last week at a church, and he told me something that you said, Mr. Floyd. It sounded identical. He said, I feel safe 2 times during the day. When I wake up in my own home, and when I come home from work to my own home. In between, I drive a nice car that I worked hard for, and people in my community think I stole it. I often see police officers pull up behind me and run my license plate and then drive off because they know I don't have any warrants. What was shocking about that statement was that was a police captain of one of our biggest law enforcement agencies in the Bay Area. If he doesn't feel safe as a police captain, how can people who don't have the resources that he has feel safe? But I want to talk about something else that you mentioned, Mr. Floyd, because we're here because individual tragedies and institutional tragedies continue to persist. And unless we do something now, they'll continue. You talked about the officers there not listening to your brother. On January 1, 2009, in Oakland, California, unarmed Oscar Grant laid on his stomach as an officer shot him in the back. And his last words before he died were, "You shot me. I have a 4-year-old daughter." On July 2014, Eric Gardner, in a chokehold in Staten Island, gasping to say, "I can't breathe," before he died. No one on the scene heard him. And your brother, Mr. Floyd, on May 25, a police officer with his knee on his neck, as your brother said, "I can't breathe. I want my mama. I can't breathe." And the officers on that scene did not hear your brother. Because of this tragedy, the world is listening now. What do you want them to hear?
I want them to stop hiring corrupted police officers. I know it's no way to figure out who's good and who's bad, but we got to find a way, because your heart has to be big if you're an officer. You just can't use the badge to be able to do what you want to do when you want to do it. You're supposed to serve and you're supposed to protect. I didn't see anybody protecting and serving that day when my brother was on his front, on his chest, hands behind his back, pleading, please, please, I can't breathe. A grown man, 46 years of age, crying for his mom. Just hurt, just looking all the time. People try to show it to you, figuring it out. They lynched my brother. That was a modern day lynching in broad daylight. People was out there pleading, please, please, get off. He can't breathe, he can't breathe. People were video recording it. Nobody cared. Nobody. My brother, he lost his life before 8 minutes and 46 seconds. He went unconscious. His life was gone. They just dragged his body across that concrete, his lifeless body. Every day, I'm going to have to live with that. My family is going to have to live with that. His kids are going to have to live with that. I just don't know. Right now, I'm happy that we are getting one step closer to justice, but for the time being, I still need time to be with my family because I haven't had that chance yet.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Rushenthaler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say thank you to all the witnesses who came here to testify today. Mr. Floyd, Ms. Underwood Jacobs. It takes an incredible amount of courage to come here and talk about this after losing a loved one. I know I speak for all my colleagues when I thank you for your willingness to come here and share your stories with this committee. And as Leader McCarthy said earlier today, George and Patrick will not be forgotten. Everyone in this room agrees that police officers who abuse their power must be held accountable for their crimes. But we can also agree that the vast majority of law enforcement officers choose their line of work because they want to protect their communities. They put themselves in harm's way every single day, and they do it to keep us and America safe. In southwestern Pennsylvania, we've seen firsthand how the selflessness of the police actually saves lives. In 2018, 11 Jewish worshipers were killed by a hateful, anti-Semitic madman at the Tree of Life synagogue. The Pittsburgh police and police from around the region ran into open gunfire, and if it were not for their heroic efforts, the tragic loss of life could have been much worse. That's why I'm incredibly alarmed to your calls from the left to defund our nation's police departments. And those on the left can try to minimize this, but I just heard my colleague from Arizona go through a litany of statements from those on the left that are calling for defund and dismantling police departments. I think that if anything, the murder of George Floyd demonstrates the need to invest more in our police departments. We should focus on improving training to promote good police practices. We should also be providing mental health care, especially for those that are struggling with PTSD and other job-related stresses. Additionally, we work to build stronger bonds between law enforcement and the community they serve. We can start by having school resource officers in our schools. But I recognize, I'm sorry, we must recognize and we must empower good police officers while terminating bad actors. With that said, Mr. Bongino, do you think that defunding our nation's police departments is an effective way of addressing instances of police misconduct?
No, it's a disastrous policy. And I think one of the issues that hasn't been considered are the second-order effects. I mean, obviously the first-order effects are quite obvious. Less police on the streets means more crime. There's simply no deterrent to crime unless you trust in the goodness of every man's heart, which would be potentially disastrous. You are going to have more crime. But think about the second-order effects. Has anyone on the panel considered the brain drain that would happen? You will have child abuse investigators who have a very unique ability to accumulate over time to look a child in the eye and know right away when they're trying to detect an abusive parent because they've not seen it. What about child sexual abuse online, where some of these people, they can look at an image and tell 6 different degrees of separation, how that person got there and who that abused child is? You're going to defund them too? What about the latent print officer that shows up at your house for a burglary that's been taking fingerprints for 20 years? Are you going to teach someone that in 5 minutes in a social worker police academy? Again, God bless our social workers. That's not what they do. What about the homicide detectives I work with? When I was a young rookie Secret Service agent, I couldn't break a guy on an interrogation. I couldn't get him to admit the crime. He didn't want to admit it. We had a guy walk in, he had experience, he walked in, knew how to interview. Within 5 minutes, we had a full confession, admitted to everything because he'd done it before. And he knew exactly the back and forth of interview and interrogation. These are skills that are going to be missing from our streets. You don't understand the catastrophe that would follow. And I can't emphasize it strong in terms of the disaster this would be if anyone follows through on it.
Thank you, Mr. Bongino. And I want to talk about the effect this would have on the communities that are most vulnerable. For example, affluent communities, if police forces were dismantled and defunded, those affluent communities would just hire private police firms. In fact, there's anecdotal evidence that's already happened in some places. But could you talk about the effect, the sad irony we would see if this happened and what it would have on the most vulnerable communities?
Yeah, think about it. With the 7-5 precinct in East New York, Brooklyn, where I worked, a couple of years before I got there, they had more homicides in that one precinct in New York City than the entire city of Baltimore had years ago. By the time I got there in the 90s, they cut that down to such a point that the entire crime rate in New York City was almost equivalent to that of Baltimore City multiple times the size. This will save real lives. We've increased our police, not decreased our police. That's insane.
Thank you. I yield.
Now we're going to Mr. Lou for his first question, 5 minutes.
I want to thank Chairman Nadler and Subcommittee Chair Bass for your excellent leadership on this outstanding legislation. We're here because Black Lives Matter. And most Republican officials have been unable to say those 3 words. The President has been unable to say it. The Attorney General hasn't said it. And the overwhelming majority of Republican senators and House members have not said it. Why does this matter? Because you can't fix the problem if you can't even identify the problem. It's not a problem with a few bad actors. This system had bad institutional racism against Black Americans. All life is precious. Black lives are subjected to much higher risk of brutality from the police than white lives. That's what the data shows. We know, for example, that Black Americans are killed at a rate twice as high from police than white Americans. Our government murdered George Floyd and countless Black Americans. And it wasn't one rogue cop who put his knee on George Floyd's neck. There were an additional 2 police officers who had their knees on George Floyd's body. And then a 4th officer who stood as a lookout. And then a Minneapolis Police Department spokesperson who gave a misleading initial account of what happened. And then there were the officers and civilians at the department who knew about the 18 misconduct claims against Derek Chauvin and didn't take strong enough action. It takes a village to allow for the persistent, systematic murder of Black Americans by our government, and this has got to stop. The Justice Legion has to take a critical step to stopping this state-sanctioned police brutality against Black Americans. It has a lot of great provisions. First, I'd like to focus on is training. Now, is training stop bad cops from doing bad things? No. But it might help good cops from doing bad things. I note for the record that in terms of training hours, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, police recruits spend on average 840 hours in basic training and 500 hours in field training for a total of 1,340 hours. In California, to be a licensed cosmetologist requires 1,600 hours. So in other words, it takes more training hours to be a hairdresser than to be a police officer. Now, just one important about hours, how we train our officers. I'm very pleased that legislation requires training in bias and racial profiling and procedural justice. My first question today is to Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, when you testified before this committee last September, you talked about procedural justice. Can you explain what procedural justice training is and why it's so important?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I can. The basic concept of procedural justice is the evidence that shows people comply with the law, not because they're afraid of the police or even going into custody. They comply with the law because they're giving a voice. They believe the law is fair and equitably applied, and the process is fair to them. We know some of the years people get tickets and we're surveying them. How you're treated determines their view about that process more than whether or not they got the ticket. So this kind of this idea of procedural justice is a way to obtain compliance, how to get people to but to comply. And it should be trained so that officers know how to gain compliance, how to give people a voice, how to recognize how they treat people has a greater impact on how they respond to that authority than anything else.
Thank you very much. My second question is to Ms. Eichel. Recently, Attorney General Bill Barr stated that he didn't think there was systemic racism in law enforcement systems. Do you agree that this is just an issue of a few rogue cops rather than the systems we currently have in place?
Not only do I disagree with him, but if Attorney General Barr would consult the reports issued in his own department on pattern and practice investigations in over 24 jurisdictions throughout the country, he would learn that systemic racism actually exists in police departments around the country that has been fully investigated and found by the Department of Justice, who sued those jurisdictions and put them under consent decree. The bad apple theory of policing reform is a failure. It looks only at individual officers and says this system is without honor. And if we want to change culture, if we want to change relationships, then you have to change the rules that govern that system. There's no change that happened in this country, especially culture change, that happened because midnight basketball, or that happened because we all got in a room and ate together. We didn't end racial discrimination and segregation in schools by all getting together and having a meeting. It actually required law to make it happen. We didn't end the barring of women from being hired in certain professions by having a conference. It required the law. And now we have found a systemic problem that has been with us for decades that requires law to actually change the context in which policing happens in this country, and to give us a chance to make and to look at public safety more broadly than we've done in the past, and to make police officers accountable in that system of public safety.
Thank you very much. The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize Mr. Klein for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Across the street from the Capitol, above the Supreme Court, is inscribed "Equal Justice Under Law." Today, I stand with my fellow Americans in condemning the brutal killing of George Floyd and so many others who have been denied that equal justice under the law. Mr. Floyd, Ms. Underwood Jacobs, we grieve with you and we mourn with you. You have our sincere condolences for your loss. Mr. Floyd's killing was an outrageous act of violence committed by a member of law enforcement with a long record of over a dozen citizen complaints. With the recent arrests of the former officers involved, I look forward to justice being served and being served quickly. But for so many others, they will not see that justice served. In the time that has passed since Mr. Floyd's murder, many more examples of injustice across the nation have had the spotlight shown on them, including Breonna Taylor in Louisville, who was killed by officers in her apartment when a no-knock warrant was served at her residence by officers looking for suspects. American justice should be served in a court of law, but sadly, many have been denied this right, having been killed while being brought into custody. Mr. Chairman, in my district office, I have a copy of one of Norman Rockwell's 4 freedoms, the freedom of speech, one of the freedoms given to us by our Creator and a cornerstone of American democracy. As we mourn the death of George Floyd, we're also witnessing Americans who continue to exercise their First Amendment rights to peaceably assemble, protest Mr. Floyd's death, and highlight other instances of police violence across the country and the need for significant, real reform. Congress should continue to work together to find solutions to these pervasive problems and ensure that all Americans are being afforded access to equal justice under the law. I believe there are many ways we can continue to work together rather than put forward policies that divide us. This committee has a long history of working together to find bipartisan solutions on issues facing our justice system. The First Step Act, just 2 years ago, reformed our federal criminal justice system. This act included provisions focused on reducing recidivism, reforming incarceration policy, correctional reforms, sentencing reforms, and improved oversight. Many of the policies included in Chairwoman Bass's bill are ideas that can achieve that bipartisan consensus once again. Increased data collection about officer-involved shootings, body cameras, outlawing chokeholds, making lynching a federal crime, demilitarizing our police forces are all areas where we can potentially find that bipartisan consensus. Although we may need to review certain tactics and methods used by law enforcement, we cannot continue to consider the irrational and ridiculous notion of defunding, disbanding, or eliminating our police departments. The rule of law is foundational in the United States, and we must advance solutions that provide fair access to justice while enforcing our laws. As John Adams said, we are a nation of laws, not of men. The vast majority of those who serve and protect are good people and stand firmly against the violent and hateful actions of bad officers. At the same time, we cannot ignore the need to have dialogue and understanding when confronting difficult issues like the ones before us today. We must also look at the departmental policies that are keeping bad officers in their positions. A substantial number of collective bargaining agreements among police departments limit officer interrogations after alleged misconduct, mandate the destruction of disciplinary records, ban civilian oversight, prevent anonymous civilian complaints, indemnify officers in the event of civil suits, and limit the length of internal investigations. Instead of efforts pursued by the majority to expand police unions, we should be limiting the scope of their collective bargaining and ensure that laws already on the books aren't hampered by contracts that they've negotiated, such as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, whose effectiveness has been diluted because DOJ's attempt to reform police departments must work around the terms of collective bargaining agreements. Mr. Floyd, you just said we might not be able to tell the good cops from the bad, but we should be able to keep the bad ones from coming back. This is a time for personal and national reflection on how we can be better neighbors and better citizens of the greatest nation on earth. I truly hope we can seize this moment in time so that Americans can come together, and I hope as legislators we can come together to craft solutions to make our community safe, strengthen the bonds that unite us, and ensure that we can live out God's direction in Micah 6, chapter 6, verse 8, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Floyd, I have a brother, too, whom I love very much, and I cannot imagine your pain right now. My heart goes out to you, and I want to just say you've been a wonderful brother to your brother and a great citizen today. So thank you for sticking with us. Professor Butler, the whole point of the social contract is that we'll be safer inside of it rather than outside in a state of danger or state of war. That's why our Constitution protects life, liberty, and property against arbitrary deprivation by the government. Now, this legislation that we're looking at today, the Justice and Policing Act, will ban chokeholds, strangleholds, no knock warrants, racial and ethnic profiling. It'll criminalize lynching. It will end the militarization of local police departments. It creates a national police misconduct registry. It strengthens the standards of police accountability. My question for you is, given that you hear someone studies this or living issues about it, is the social contract working for African Americans today with respect to policing? And if not, will this legislation actually vindicate the value of human life that members on both sides of the aisle have spoken about?
Indeed, Congressman. I was so moved by Mr. Johnson's introduction when he talked about the dignity of every human life. And then we heard Ranking Member Jordan echo Mr. Floyd's heartfelt plea that life is precious. The Justice Act of 2020 reaffirms the sanctity of life It establishes a national standard for when the police can legally kill people and requires officers to employ de-escalation techniques. The act states that cops can only kill people as a last resort and requires them to try to de-escalate the situation before result into deadly force. This is common sense, but it's not the law now.
Thank you. Ms. Gupta, do you agree with Mr. Crump that we should impose the traditional doctrine of respondeat superior, let the master answer employee on police departments so that they have the proper incentives to carefully train and supervise and monitor their officers?
Yes, I do.
Ms. Eiffel, Mayor Morial spoke of the history of lynching and racism and the cycles of American history, and there have been two other moments in our history when America moved aggressively to try to transcend the original curse of violent white supremacy. One was Reconstruction, which lasted 12 years after the Civil War before it was undone by racism. And the second was the modern civil rights movement, so-called Second Reconstruction, when the blood sacrifice of Dr. King and Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman and Medgar Evers and Bob Moses and our colleague John Lewis and many others gave us the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this civil rights movement, this Second Reconstruction, also faced a violent backlash. What are our prospects for a third and enduring Reconstruction today, Ms. Eiffel? What needs to happen for us to transcend the nightmare of racist violence and injustice that we seem to have been trapped in?
Thank you. Well, for purposes of this hearing, every member of this body has to take responsibility for what is happening in this country and decide that they will put behind them their election prospects, their soundbite Fox News, or any other news network. They have to decide that they will get their hands around this problem. And that means working together to try and solve what the people in cities in every state in this country have told them the last 2 weeks is a problem that people will not tolerate anymore. It takes courage. It is going to take a lot of work for all of you in that body to come together. But this bill has provisions that I believe we can agree on from what I've heard today. And I would encourage people to read the bill. This bill is not repeal qualified immunity, for example. It actually changes the standard that courts have stored over time. Read the bill. There is nothing in this bill that is objectionable to anyone who cares about policy, who cares about anti-discrimination and pledges themselves to it, who cares about the rule of law, and who cares about this country, and who believes, as many have said today, that they owe something to Mr. Floyd and his family, and even to Ms. Jacobs and her family, because police